Hey gang, John O'Brien here, week number 5 of the Clampdown. Jamestown Community College History 1520, moving now into chapter 37, the end of empire. Unfortunately for us, not the end of the coronavirus pandemic. In the news today, look, basically we need to find testing for everybody. Some of us might have already had this and have been asymptomatic. We carry the antibodies. We might not get it again, at least not as virulently. So there's a real need for testing. That's falling short. There is a real need for treatment. A lot of things are in the works. Please trust the science, not the gut instincts here. There's a real need for vaccine, which takes a long time to develop. But until we get one or develop a lot of herd immunity where a lot of people, 75, 80% people have had COVID-19 and have antibodies to resist it again, we're not going to enter a new normal. Okay? So let's trust the science and the data, including the mathematics, the public health authorities. In the meantime, we all need to continue to isolate. We're doing a good job here in Chautauqua County, clamping down to stop this wave from hitting, right? To stop our health facilities and personnel from being overwhelmed, right? So look, I'm not a public health expert. I don't even play one on TV, maybe on YouTube. But let's trust them. Right? Let's try to stay away from people who are not already in our own household. Wear masks in public. We've been saying that for a long time. Sanitize hard surfaces. Keep your distance when you're out in public, and just try to stay home because there's a lot of history you can do at home. Right? So, including this lecture here, and in fact, how about the stuff I put up recently? Let's just pull that up again. I did get a couple emails, people like, I'm not sure where we are, what's going on. Please check the announcement sections of Blackboard. I think I have this set to email to you automatically, so make sure your email accepts Blackboard, doesn't spam it out. For the announcements, what's up there now? For the week of April the 24th through the 29th, well that's not quite a week, John, but April 24th, 29th, or sooner if you wish, because it's already up, and here I am on April the 19th. Chapter 36 in 3 parts. Me, and not me, okay? Parts 1 and 2 are a lecture. Part 3 is about a 15-minute video from PBS. It's a great documentary on total war, and in it you will see the use of primary source video material, oral source, oral history from people who lived through World War II, so we know this was filmed, at least the documentary sections a while ago, and really good secondary source narrative, right? The people's history. What was the war like for people on all sides of the war, right? At least most sides of the war. Please do chapter 36, so you got to read it first, okay? And then read chapter 37 and do the quiz on 37, and in not necessarily the same order. Make sure you're discussing chapter 36 after you've read it and viewed both the lecture and the documentary, so you can discuss intelligently the course material. If you are in the hybrid section and you were assigned to present for chapter 36, you're the forum leader, okay? So the discussion board, you kind of manage it, and you should respond to people's inquiries and questions, and I'll kind of overview it. I'll be honest, I have had a problem once in a while with Blackboard discussion forums, okay? So if it is a problem for you, email me. Sometimes I frankly can't get it to work. I'm sorry, and if I can't, how can I expect you to? So if it's not working, what I'm going to do is put up a Google document, a Google sheet, so we can all kind of just chime in on that, okay? So we'll have a workaround there. All right, so should read chapter 36, watch chapter 36 in 3 parts, do the discussion for 36, and then move on and read and do the quiz for 37, because that's what I'm going to start lecturing on here. I'm only going to do 1 part in this video, because it's a big chapter, right? The end of empire. Okay, so we talked about imperialism in the late 19th century. For the most part, those empires withstood most, well, at least the first half of the 20th century, with some exceptions, right? 1946, the Philippines goes free from the United States, so at least the first half of the 20th century. And here at the end, the decades after World War II, the empires will fall. Okay, the empires will fall. Let's move into this. We'll do a little bit of video and call it a night. Or a day, depending on who watches. The end of empire. Okay. India had been controlled by the British since the mid-1800s, right? Indian nationalists, be they Muslim or Hindu, had pushed for greater autonomy and independence. Gandhi, foremost among them, wanted a united yet free India. They pushed for self-rule. What will happen is India will be partitioned after World War II by a victorious yet exhausted Great Britain. It'll be divided essentially along religious lines. So we'll have a predominantly Muslim Pakistan in East Pakistan, later becomes Bangladesh, and a mostly Hindu India. The great tragedy, other than just the partition, the great tragedy is what happened if you were Hindu living on the Muslim side of the line in northwest India, in the Punjab, or in Bangladesh? What happened if you're Muslim in India, the new nation of India in 1947? You were already a minority, now you're really a super minority. And there was great violence, great sectarian violence, Hindus versus Muslims, Muslims versus Hindus. Gandhi himself will be killed, actually by a Hindu fanatic, so this great man of peace. So we should really pause and consider, right? During the early 20th century, when a time of real monsters like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, you have this man of peace, right? Mohandas Gandhi, the Mahatma, right? The great soul. India, post-independence, along with Pakistan, will mostly follow the path of non-alignment. Okay? We saw the rise of the Cold War, where the world will become divided between the United States-led West, capitalist democracies for the most part, well, capitalist nations, not always democracies, right? And the East, led by the communist Soviet Union. Well, there were some nations in the middle who didn't want to side with either of the great superpowers. India will be among them, in some ways playing off the Soviets against the United States. Okay? Vietnam will be a place where the Cold War turns hot. Okay? Vietnam had been a French colony, Indochine or Indochina, since, again, the mid-1800s in this case. But that had only provoked Vietnamese nationalism, right? So Vietnam for the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh had actually clamored for a free Vietnam in Paris. He had gone there as a baker, as a young man, a baker, pâtisserie, right? In the bakeries of Paris, he could speak French. He'd argued near Versailles for the freedom for the Vietnamese, and almost no one listened to him, right? Wilson's self-determination was frankly just for Caucasian people, so-called, for light-skinned people, for European people and those of their descent. Okay? So Ho Chi Minh will lead a partisan struggle against the Japanese occupation of Vietnam and will declare independence, in fact, emulating some of Thomas Jefferson's own Declaration of Independence against the Empire of Britain. Here's Ho Chi Minh declaring independence against the Empire of France. But the French will reassert rule, okay, after Japan is defeated. The Vietnamese nationalists, with the aid of Communist Soviet Union and after 1949, Communist Chinese will fight the French. Okay, they will fight the French. They will defeat the French by 1954, Battle of Dien Bien Phu. As the French evacuate, the United States slowly enters what will be known as a quagmire, kind of the quicksand of Vietnam. In 1954, the Geneva Convention, Vietnam was to be kind of temporarily divided with elections in North and South. Those elections were not free and fair. Okay, the United States supported the non-communists in the South, even though the leaders there were non-democratic. The North will go communist. Okay, Vietnam War, the National Liberation Front will be supported again by the Communist Chinese and the Communist Soviet Union. The United States will support the unpopular Southern government. Okay, this intervention will begin with Eisenhower, a Republican, escalated with John Kennedy, Democrat, and massively escalated with Lyndon Johnson, again Democrat. Okay? Johnson will massively escalate the war that is now fought by Vietnamese, North Vietnam, and the nationalists in South Vietnam, so-called Viet Cong, armed by the Northern Communists against Americans and their South Vietnamese allies. So it sounds rather confusing, but essentially it's a war for nationalism, a war for independence against the French. As they're driven out, the United States enters, a war for independence against the United States, in which the nationalists, the independence fighters, were armed by the Soviet Union and the Chinese. And the United States ended up supporting unpopular governments in the South, increasingly unpopular governments in the South. Okay? Johnson would massively escalate the war in 1964 through 1968, whereupon he decided not to run for re-election. He ascended to the presidency with the assassination of John Kennedy in November 1963. Pushed for some very good things domestically, most of us would argue, at least your liberal historians. Civil rights, okay, Medicare, Medicaid, okay, aid for dependent children, these types of things, Head Start, okay, these great kind of social programs that come out of the Great Society. But this is a war, many would argue, for empire in Vietnam. Johnson did not want to look soft on communism. And the Tet Offensive, when the Viet Cong pushed even into the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and it's on television, right? Television becomes an important medium in the Vietnam War. This stuff is televised every night. Right? American troops, very young, perhaps some of them poorly trained, not all by any means, burning villages, because you couldn't tell who the enemy was. The enemy looked like almost anyone else in Vietnam, especially in the rural areas. So American troops, young, often inexperienced, frustrated, angry American troops, would go into these villages sometimes and burn them to the ground, along with all the food for the year. Okay, that fall's harvest of rice, for example. And as this thing, these tragedies were filmed, right, for live television, well, not live, that day's televised broadcast on the three main networks, only three networks in the United States at the time, CBS, NBC, and ABC, and most of the country would tune into Walter Cronkite on CBS at 6:30, who gave the facts without spin. How many South Vietnamese, the United States ally, died that day? How many Americans died in the war that day? How many North Vietnamese died that day? How many Viet Cong died that day? Because there's no other way to judge the progress of the war. Americans were not winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people when they were burning villages, okay, and taking food, okay. So this body count became just a perverse way of measuring the progress of the war. It was clear the United States was not winning the hearts and minds of the people in Vietnam, or increasingly even in the United States. Public opinion, the discourse began to turn against the United States involvement. Johnson then will not run for re-election in 1968, will not seek nor accept the nomination of his party, as he said, which kind of paved the way for, well, an open Democratic primary in which Robert F. Kennedy comes out against the war and is assassinated. Hubert Humphrey ends up becoming the vice presidential candidate. That was a real mess of a convention in Chicago in 1968. Nixon's going to promise law and order, okay, order in American streets and victory in Vietnam, and win. Okay, conservative California Republican, who actually will expand the war and then call for its Vietnamization, meaning to arm, supply, and fund the South Vietnamese against the Viet Cong in the South, communists, and the North Vietnamese, to get American troops out. American troops are out by 1973. Nixon will actually be out of office for other reasons, domestic scandal called Watergate, by 1975. His vice president, Gerald Ford, ascends to the presidency and is in office as South Vietnam, the United States ally, without any official American troops there, falls to communism, and Vietnam today is a communist nation. United, it is a communist nation. Big mistake for the United States was this real Truman doctrine of containment, when in fact the Vietnamese had long wanted independence. It was a war more for nationalism than for communism. It was something the best and brightest, so-called, in the State Department, in the Pentagon, and in the Oval Office, be they Republican or Democrat, did not see. It's a great tragedy for the Vietnamese people, but also for the United States. Independence in Asia. You may recall at the end of World War I, Arab peoples by and large had assisted the Allies, the British essentially, against the Ottoman Turks in a cause that was victorious, right? The Ottoman Turks lost in World War I. In fact, the Ottoman Empire will be broken apart. But then the British and the French proceeded to essentially divvy up the so-called Middle East, right? Which is really a misnomer. Middle East it's really Southwest Asia, but it's the land between Britain and India. The British called the Middle East, so that name in some ways is stuck. As British and French mandates, might be called colonies, one of which Palestine will essentially be promised in the Balfour Declaration to the Jewish people of Europe, who, let's face it, had suffered unimaginable horror during World War II, the Holocaust. They had suffered persecution, even among, even in the lands occupied by the Nazis at the hands of the French, for example. Okay, or people who were not the Nazis. Okay, would turn them in. So there's a great feeling that Jewish people were not safe even in Europe. They should have a homeland for themselves. Of course, we would call that nationalism. And what would be the homeland for Jewish people who had been living in Europe for centuries, really for thousands of years, okay, since the Roman Empire? It was the traditional homeland, okay, of Palestine. So this idea of Zionism was a goal for Jewish people to, in a way, return, although very few of them had ever been to Palestine, return to the land of Israel, okay, to the land of Judah, technically. So Jewish people from across Europe and really from around the world began to move into Palestine, a British mandate, British essentially colony. Problem is, there are people already living there, the Palestinians, okay, who have really no say in the matter. It becomes a very, very complicated situation in which you can perhaps see all sides. Palestinians see more and more people moving into their land, Jews moving in, said this was our land thousands of years before and we're not safe anyplace else. But that will lead to tensions. Okay? That will lead to war after 1948 when Israel becomes an independent nation and its Arab nations declare war on it, but Israel was able to defend itself, okay, with Western-made weapons and actually add more territory to its nation. Okay? This remains, in some ways, a tinderbox today as the population of Palestinians, mostly Muslim but also Christian, is rising within Israel. We see this ethnic state, right, where Palestinians are now demanding their own nation free from Israel. Palestinians in Israel declaring that parts of that country are theirs, what we call that Palestinian nationalism, right? So, very complicated situation for which, frankly, and obviously, I don't have answers. In Egypt, okay, now we're looking to North Africa, Abdel Nasser became the leader of Egypt. After World War II, Nasser takes the road of non-alignment, not taking the side of the United States or the Soviet Union, rose to power in an army coup, good French word there, an overthrow of state, and pushed Egypt in a much more secular direction, a less religious direction, okay? Against Israel, okay, in the wars against Israel, but not aligned or allied with the United States or the Soviet Union. In the Suez Crisis, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the canal between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and Britain, France, and the United States, Britain, France, and Israel, mobilized essentially for war. Eisenhower, the American president, along with the Soviet Union, supported Nasser, essentially. The United States told the British, the French, and the Israelis to back off, and they did. Nasser became really a great hero in the Arab world, okay, by taking this non-aligned path. Lastly, for the lecture today, because we're almost halfway through the chapter, the old French colony of Algeria in North Africa. The people of Algeria suffered through World